Our topic today is one of the great topics of our era, I believe, and of course it's America's case for China's WTO accession and normal trade relations. Our speaker, as you know, is Ambassador Charlene Barshefsky, who's had an extraordinarily interesting career. Starting almost from the beginning. She's from the University of Wisconsin. Her law degree is from the Columbus School at Catholic University. She was an international trade, law, and policy lawyer with the Washington law firm for 18 years before she became deputy U.S. trade representative with the beginning of the Clinton administration. She was in that position for 4 years, was the acting U.S. trade representative for a year, and for the last 3 years has been our nation's trade representative. The number of agreements that she's had a major role in is enormous. I mentioned the number 275, which is in her resume. It's covered, as all of you know, the major areas of the world. She's been very active in regional agreements, helping to launch, of course, free trade area alliance for the Americas. She's been active with APEC in the same kind of role, with the European Union, and of course with the President's Africa Initiative, and has been an architect of several major global access arrangements and has initiated more. Now, as one looks at this enormous amount of activity, one can only imagine the intelligence and the cleverness and wit and charm that's required to deal with a group of extraordinarily savvy and competent friends across the table. It's that extraordinary experience and huge competence that, of course, the ambassador brings to this question today. We've all witnessed a wide variety of important arguments being raised about the importance of trade, about the importance of reform relative to the engagement matters, even accommodation in the long term, and certainly the contrary, the negative positions of the importance of human rights and labor issues, neither of which are negative in themselves, but negative relative to the approval, of course. For an organization such as this, it's an exciting time because this is truly a historic issue, and it's probably the first issue since the end of the Cold War which has been debated so extensively and thoroughly in a variety of fora, a debate which we, of course, believe is so important to the success of American foreign policy. As I say, we're delighted to have this extraordinarily gifted and experienced guest. It's my pleasure to present to you Ambassador Charlene Barshefsky.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. There weren't quite enough adjectives. But thank you. That was very, very, very kind. Let me say that it's a pleasure to be here. I've long wanted to come here, having heard a lot about this group from Congressman Ben Cardin, who told me some years ago that he always made his major foreign policy addresses here first before he made them on Capitol Hill, and I can understand why, seeing so many distinguished people here today. Let me thank Frank Bird for inviting me here and offer special greetings to Helen Bentley, to County Executive Curry, and to Ken Montague, and both of whom I hope we will hear from immediately after my remarks. Let me just say that the choice that Congress will make tomorrow, the vote is tomorrow, in this debate on the question of China's accession to the World Trade Organization and permanent normal trade relations, will affect the prospects of your neighbors on the job, the prospects for reform and development of the rule of law within China, and America's most fundamental national interest. Let me, though, begin with just a brief look at the trade policy implications of the agreement that we negotiated with China, because, of course, the WTO accession of China and PNTR are, in the first instance, trade issues. To enter the World Trade Organization, China has made an extraordinary series of comprehensive, one-way trading concessions to open up their markets across a full range of goods and services and agriculture in a manner unprecedented in the modern era in China. The agreement strengthens, in addition, our guarantees of fair trade from China, gives us far greater ability to enforce China's trade commitments, and facilitates the WTO entry of Taiwan, which itself made an equally valuable set of market opening commitments. By contrast, we change no market access policies toward China. We don't change a single tariff, nothing. We don't change our trade laws. We don't change our export control laws. We don't change our laws governing sensitive technologies. We don't change anything. We agree only to maintain the market status China has in the U.S., normal trade relations. We agree only to maintain that status, which China has received year in, year out, in every year for the past 20 years on a permanent basis. That's no change in trade policy per se, because annual NTR is the trade status China has had in every year since the establishment of diplomatic relations with China in 1979. And it's the trade status every Congress and every president has given to China, even in moments of greatest tension with China, for example, post-Tiananmen Square. Our commitment with respect to China's accession, as it is with respect to the accession of any country, is to make that normal trade status permanent. Now, permanent NTR is the only issue before the Congress. Regardless of the congressional debate, China will enter the WTO. Regardless of the congressional debate, China will continue to sell to the United States. The only question that is before the Congress is whether we will benefit from China's accession, or will we have opened the China market for the rest of the world but leave our own workers and farmers behind. And the reason for this distinction is that under international rules, every country must give to every other country permanent, normal trade relation status to enjoy the full benefit of market opening in each other's markets. We're the only country in the world that does not give China permanent normal trade relation status. If Congress denies PNTR, we have no legal right to the market opening commitments that we negotiated, but the rest of the world will. That obviously would be an untenable situation. Think about it from the point of view of Maryland. Whether semiconductors or soybeans or auto parts, who's going to sell to China? This is 20% of the world's population. Will it be Maryland producers or European? We grow soybeans, so does Argentina. America grows wheat, so does Brazil. Maryland makes telecom equipment, but so does Europe and Japan. This is an economic issue of very substantial importance to the United States, substantial importance to Maryland as your county executive and as Ken Montague will discuss when I'm done. But the key here is, the only question before the Congress is, will we get the benefit of China's accession and the market opening that we negotiated, Or will we simply hand it to the rest of the world and leave our folks behind? So, from the perspective of American economic self-interest, I think the choice is clear. But China's accession carries with it far broader implications than merely the economics. And I think it's fair and it's right to judge the accession on a basis beyond economics. We're, after all, talking about the question of reform in China. We're talking about the question of America's strategic interests in this century. And I think we have to look at the accession on those bases as well, and indeed perhaps foremost on those bases. China is the world's largest country. Over the past decade, it's been the world's fastest growing large economy. And the future of our relationship with China will have great bearing on American security and strategy in this century. We all know our relationship with China is free neither of moments of extraordinary attention nor deep-seated disagreement. And I think that we have to face those moments of tension and disagreements quite squarely as we look at this accession and try and determine whether this accession will help reduce some of the tension and help further some of our interests and the interests of the people of China as opposed to the regime of China. And to do that, let me just take a moment to trace back to the beginning the organization that China wants to join. The WTO has its origins in the last address that Franklin Roosevelt made. It was 17 days before he died, and he sent a message to Congress. In this letter, he called for the opening of negotiations among the countries of the world to create what was then called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. He called this GATT Global Trade Initiative, and I quote, the last chance to lay an economic basis for the secure and peaceful world we all desire. And he closed his message to Congress with the following statement. He said, the point in history at which we now stand is full of promise and danger. The world will either move toward unity and widely shared prosperity, or it will move apart. We have a chance, we citizens of the United States, to use our influence in favor of a more united and cooperating world. Whether we do so, as far as it's in our power, will determine the kinds of lives our grandchildren will live. Americans in that age were up to the challenge. The completion of the GATT was one element of what became a much larger post-war internationalism adopted by our post-war leaders, Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, Adenauer, and so on. This internationalism, this post-war conception, was built between the closing of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 and the ratification of the NATO Treaty in 1949. And the institutions created during that period are the foundation of modern security policy and modern economic policy. And think about what they created in that span of 4.5 years. The concept of collective security, embodied by the UN, NATO, the Rio Treaty, and then a core of Pacific alliances. Commitment to human rights, embodied by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted actually in the main by a Chinese. Open markets and economic stability through creation of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the GATT system. The GATT system is the forerunner of the WTO. The name was changed in 1995. So the World Trade Organization and WTO, protests aside, is nothing new. It is a continuation of an extraordinary 55-year legacy. To look at the trade element of that legacy, there were 23 founding countries of the GATT, largely our post-war allies, a couple Latin American countries. One of those 23 was China, because they were a post-war ally. The system since has added 122 other economies, has grown to cover 4.6 billion people, and the agenda has broadened from earlier reductions of tariffs to get rid of the more pernicious side of the Smoot-Hawley Act from the 1930s, a lowering of tariffs to encompass intellectual property rights, financial services, telecom, agriculture, duty-free cyberspace, so on and so forth. And this global rules-based system, because the entire system is based on essentially a complex series of contractual rules and market opening, more than fulfilled Roosevelt's vision. It has sparked the growth of living standards around the world. Since 1950, as world markets have opened, trade has expanded 15-fold, global production has expanded 6-fold, per capita incomes have tripled. And we have seen historically unprecedented social progress these last 50 years. Global life expectancy is up 20 years. Global infant mortality is down by 2/3, and famine has largely receded from all but the most war-torn, remote, or misgoverned corners of the world. The global system has also provided economic security, and we saw this in the Asian financial crisis of last year. 40% of the world was in recession. These are like conditions from the 1930s. 40% of the world was in recession. But because of WTO rules, countries kept their markets open. And that gave countries affected by recession a way out, not through political conflict, but through economic growth. And this system, envisioned by Roosevelt and carried through by Harry Truman, has helped us address challenges most fundamental to a more secure world. It was created in part to reintegrate Japan and Germany after the war. It then brought in the countries that were emerging from colonial rule in the 1960s and 1970s. Now the challenge is to bring in the countries of the former Soviet Republic, the transition economies, every one of which has applied for WTO membership. And that brings me then to China. China, the world's largest nation, as I said, for many years was one of the great rents in the trading system. When our modern relationship with China began in 1972, when Richard Nixon went to China, as you'll recall, China's economy was virtually entirely divorced from that of the outside world. After the Communist Revolution in 1949, it expelled foreign businesses, it banned contact between Chinese citizens and foreigners. At home, there was virtually no space for private life. Private farming, private business were forbidden. Externally, of course, China conducted what minimal trade it needed to through a few selected ministries. These policies impoverished China at home, contributed to its revolutionary role in Asia. Isolated from Asian markets, Asia's largest nation had absolutely no stake in peace and stability beyond its own borders, and indeed saw every advantage in its revolutionary foreign policy in chaos beyond its own borders, some of which it helped to spark. In the intervening years, American trade policy has worked to end this isolation. Our policies, of course, in detail, have advanced specific American interests, but they've also helped to push forward a strategic vision by opening China's markets over time, by helping China to have access to world markets. we've sought to ensure that this nation of 1.3 billion people plays its proper role as an export market and as a source of economic growth for its Asian neighbors. We've sought to help promote reform and liberalization within China and ultimately help China to find a healthier and different role in the Pacific region. This is a strategy consistent with China's own internal reforms. At home, since the 1970s, China has reversed some of the more damaging policies of the disastrous Great Leap Forward and the euphemistic Cultural Revolution, abolishing the rural commune system, reviving private businesses in cities and villages. And externally, reform has opened China more to the world, substantially relaxing, though not abandoning entirely, bans on inward foreign investment and private export trade. U.S. trade policy has worked with this slow process of reform at every step, from the lifting of the trade embargo in 1972, the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1979, and then the grant of normal trade relations each and every year since, to negotiation with China of a number of agreements in intellectual property rights and textiles and agriculture. If you look at a case in point, take intellectual property. To be sure, we wanted to stop the export by China of pirated CDs and CD-ROM and business software. And they've done that. But think about what this means. To create an intellectual property rights regime, which China did not have, is to create laws and enact them. It's to create a judicial system. It's to inform citizens of their rights under the law. It is to give them access to a judicial system. It is to create ultimately a legal regime and due process where absolutely none had existed before. This is one example of a much broader process of reform, of opening to the world, and of a very slow adaptation to internationally accepted principles that has served China and her neighbors and the United States very, very well. In China, this slow process has helped over 250 million Chinese escape from poverty. For us, of course, it has meant an increase in exports. But the advantages go beyond material gain. China remains an authoritarian and repressive regime. Make no mistake about that. But reform has plainly strengthened personal freedoms. Reform has plainly begun the process of developing a rule of law within China. And as we saw in the Asian financial crisis, when China, instead of hawking a revolutionary role, contributed to the bailout packages the IMF put together for its Asian neighbors, China is slowly becoming a more integrated, more responsible player in the Pacific community. Now, with the conclusion of the bilateral agreement we negotiated for China's WTO entry, we see that a China which for decades was among the great enemies of a peaceful, of a freer world Roosevelt envisioned, now making the commitment to join the trading system. It has done so, as I said, through a comprehensive series of one-way concessions. I won't go into detail. You've all read about this in the newspaper, but let me make a couple of brief points. First off, reducing trade barriers. China will slash tariffs and eliminate quotas and import bans, grant unprecedented rights to market and distribute products within China. Policy reforms. China will reform a huge array of economic policies, from unfair taxes to customs restrictions to agricultural restrictions, to a broad range of reform that will over time reduce state power in economic matters in China. Fair trade. The agreement will strengthen our guarantee of fairly traded imports from China through a variety of remedies and mechanisms. Enforcement. We have in this agreement more means of enforcement of China's trade commitments than in any agreement we have ever negotiated, whether under our own trade laws or WTO dispute settlement or a special series of remedies that we've created just for this accession. And Taiwan's accession. China's entry, as I said, will facilitate the entry of Taiwan. This will bring us substantial trade benefits because China made a good series of market opening, Taiwan made a good series of market opening concessions to us. But hopefully, the fact that both China and Taiwan would sit at the same table in the WTO might lead to a lessening of cross-strait tensions. It is no surprise that one of the first official pronouncements made by Chen Shui-bian, the new Taiwan president, was his support for PNTR for China and China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Our responsibility, as I said, is simply making the trade status we've always given to China permanent. From an economic standpoint, I think the decision is clear. But let me take just one more minute and talk about the broader implications. If you stand back from the detail of the agreement we negotiated, all 250 pages of it, you will see among the commitments the following pattern. China will, for the first time since the 1940s, permit foreigners and Chinese to import and export freely to and from China. For the first time since the 1940s, China will allow direct foreign investment in information industries, including telecom, and in this agreement, the net. Think about that just for a moment. There are about 20 million net users in China. There will be by the end of this year. Most of our high-tech folks believe that by 2003 there will be over 100 million users of the net. You see the transformative power of the internet in our country, and we're the most open country in the world. Imagine the potential transformative power of the net in China. I know the Chinese regime wants to control content. Good luck. For the first time since the 1940s, China will reduce the role of the state in economic enterprises, including the closure of a number of state-run operations. And for the first time ever in any agreement, China will submit to binding dispute settlement and arbitration and agree to the imposition of sanctions if they refuse to comply when they lose a case. These are remarkable victories for economic reform in China and for economic reformers in China. And it is a remarkable potential victory beyond economic reform. It is that possibility of reform beyond the economic, as well as economic reform, that many leading dissidents in China, whether Bao Teng, jailed for 7 years after Tiananmen, Ren Wanding, a founder of China's modern human rights movement, Dai Qing, one of China's leading environmentalists, Martin Lee, one of the world's foremost democracy advocates and leader of the Hong Kong Democratic Party, and now the Dalai Lama, see China's entry into the WTO and PNTR as one of the most important steps in reform in 20 years. Indeed, they say not one of the most important step in reform in China in 20 years. And they see it as reformist in two ways. One, it breaks the back of the monopoly hold of the state on economic life. And number two, we see from the Asia pattern, and it doesn't mean this will happen in China, but if you play the odds, you wouldn't be foolish. You see from the pattern in Asia, if you look at Korea, at the Philippines, at Thailand, at Taiwan, that economic reform has been a critical predicate of broader political reform, not overnight, but over 20 or 30 or 40 years, that's the kind of change that has affected Asia in general. And that's the kind of change these leaders see as potential here. I'll leave you with one last view, and that is, apart from the economic benefit and apart from the support of economic reform and reformers in China, I think the full significance of the debate that Congress will undertake tomorrow is clear when you look at the broader U.S.-China relationship, because that relationship is fundamental to peace and security in the Asia-Pacific region and in the world. We have very substantial differences with China related to human rights, related to religious freedom, related to nuclear non-proliferation, and in other areas. And the United States, in that situation, must vigorously, aggressively assert its rights and its values. Trade agreements are not a substitute for sound human rights policies. But we also have an obligation, apart from standing for our values, we also have an obligation to look for areas of common ground and to act on those areas where we find them. We do it on environmental matters. We do it with respect to peace in the Korean Peninsula. We did it in the Asian financial crisis. And we have the ability to do it here on economic issues. Were we to reject a series of one-way concessions made by China of this breadth, of this magnitude and scope, were we to reject this, we would be making a very dark statement indeed about the possibility of ever having a mutually constructive relationship with China. Were we to retreat, were Congress to vote no on PNTR, we would threaten every major interest we have in China, from our work on non-proliferation and arms control to reducing tensions in the Korean Strait, in the Korean Peninsula. It would complicate for the foreseeable future our Pacific alliances. Our allies in the Pacific would view rejection of PNTR as an unnecessary rejection of stable and constructive relations between the U.S. and their neighbor in their neighborhood. And it would be viewed by them as the U.S. turning away from an open and confident vision of peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. And over the long term, and maybe most important, China, seeing no rational reason for our rejection, would likely be inclined to read hostile intention behind every move. And you know, hardliners in China already do that, exacerbating tensions as they arise. I'll leave you with the last thought that is Maryland specific, because it makes it really very concrete. It does for me. Tomorrow afternoon, 1,000 young men and women will graduate from the Naval Academy in Annapolis. This agreement is as important to them as it is to any business or any farmer or any factory worker in the United States, because a number of these graduates will take up commissions in the Pacific Fleet. Others will participate in military exercises in Korea and Japan and in Southeast Asia. And others will plan our Pacific strategy from the Pentagon. And for them, in each of these areas, China's view of our country and of our intentions toward China is of fundamental importance. China, of course, is going to make its own decisions. As the President said, we can't control what China does at the end of the day. But as China proceeds to reform and to make those decisions, our choice this week, were we to vote in the negative, would be at a very high cost. We have the kind of historic moment Roosevelt saw 55 years ago. We have that moment now. And this decision, more than any other decision this Congress is going to take on international matters for decades, will have the profoundest bearing on our children and on our grandchildren. And members of Congress understand the historic nature of the vote they are about to make. To reject PNTR would damage our trade interests, it would set back the cause of reform in China, and it would risk, without cause, a fundamental deterioration in our relationship with China. But if we have confidence and wisdom and foresight that the Roosevelts and the Trumans had, we have an extraordinary opportunity to effect reform in China, to make China a more secure, constructive partner in Asia, and for the benefit of the Chinese people. China's accession is one of the most important steps in decades that China can take. PNTR is one of the most important steps in decades that we can take to ensure that accession. We are hopeful that Congress will have the wisdom and the foresight and the confidence to not let this moment pass us by. With that, I want to thank you again very much for having me here. I know that Mr. Curry and Mr. Montague are going to want to make some comments, and so I'll step aside and let you do just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. I just wanted to make a few comments. This is a really important issue for me. Some of you probably wonder how in the world this guy get involved in this kind of stuff. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in a small country in South Africa right after college, and it's a country called Lesotho. And it was a very poor country, one of the poorest countries on the continent of Africa, but very literate. And I remember going around the country and looking at all of the things that were produced in that country and all of the needs that were in that country. And I said, you know, it would be so wonderful if somehow this country and my country could get together and they could exchange these things. They would be better off and we would be better off. And I never thought I'd have an opportunity to do anything about that. I had visions at one time of being in international trade and wound up being way down the totem pole and became a lawyer. But I remember my whole interest was rejuvenated. I think it was Carla Hills, was it, who was a U.S. Trade Representative, and she gave a speech over at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And this was after I was elected, and I was so fascinated by what she was talking about, and I said, you know, this is the thing that I really, really dreamed of all my life. And through NCSL, I got involved with the USTR, and I have served, I guess, with three of the Mickey Cantor and Ira Shapiro, and now Charlene Barshefsky. And I would just like to make a personal note, because I think Ambassador Barshefsky has kind of topped it all. She is probably one of the most dynamic and assertive ambassadors that I have worked with. And the reason I know that is, as a concrete way, is because they have my fax number at home. And many times at 3 o'clock in the morning, my fax rings, and I wake up and I says, I know who that is. And it's the U.S. Trade Representative. And sure enough, the next morning when I get up, there's another fax. I think I've probably gone through, I don't know how many reams of paper I've gone through. But What that does is make this even more exciting and certainly more important. Here in the state of Maryland, I just went through to do a little bit of research on this to find out what would be the general impact on the state of Maryland. And from what I see, the first big winners in this would be our own agricultural industry. What I found out was that the second largest market for poultry in the world is China. I think that'll make Frank Perdue and a number of others on the Eastern Shore very happy. Also, we produce soybean, and that is the largest, China is the largest growth market for soybean. I think we had somewhere around $52 million worth of exports in soybean back in 1999, $83 million in poultry in 1989. We look at our export to China has grown by 54% since 1993. Number of companies that you all recognize, Chindex from Bethesda has done $30 million worth of medical equipment with China. RTKL has a contract for $200 million to build about 1 million square foot museum and center for technology and science with China. The opportunities for us are incredible. But those are just at the producer end. The other thing that we need to look at is the jewel that I know our Congressman Bentley has been so protective of over the years, and that's the Port of Baltimore. 18,000 direct jobs, 127,000 indirect jobs, just here in this port, right behind us. My father used to have a saying, and I always lived by it. He said, he always told me, he says, son, you know, if you can't keep up, drop back. And what that told me was that, you know, if you're not going to be able to play the game the way it's supposed to be played, get out of the game. Now, in this country, from my perspective, we definitely are in this game. And we need to stay in it. And certainly PNTR is the way that we stay in it. And I have no doubt that on all fronts we will wind up being winners. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow. Nervous, of course, as you are, but confident. Thank you.
Well, I tell you, after listening to so many eloquent expressions this afternoon, I don't know if I deserve to be at this podium or not. You are a somewhat intimidating throng. Everyone's so serious. The ambassador has obviously done a superb job of presenting not only the content, but the implications of that extraordinary agreement that she and her staff negotiated. And it is indeed extraordinary. It's remarkable for us to occupy this moment in history with all the profound implications. And while I enjoy that and am appreciative of what it means, I suspect I'm not here for that purpose, but to provide a little levity and a little human face, a little comic relief, so to speak, on the extraordinary implications of it. You know, Prince George's County is right outside of Washington. And for many years, our principal industry was agricultural, largely tobacco and some other kinds of products. We have changed extraordinarily in the last 3 decades to be a center of commerce and technology in the state of Maryland. In fact, the second biggest reservoir of technology companies in the state. That transformation for us has been dramatic and profound, and in many ways is a small example of what can happen even in the Chinese economy. If this was a theoretical, abstract matter, as it is for some people, I would not have the enthusiasm that I share today. But since I've lived it after a lifetime of being in Prince George's County, I know how important, how personal, and how tangible the results of these kinds of efforts can actually be. I also had the privilege of traveling to China last fall, and I was astounded by the transformations in that country. I went to a city of 4.5 million people that had been built in 19 years. And it was a sterling, spectacular example of what's going on there. I was informed by an international businessman that 2/3 of the heavy industrial cranes in the world are operating in China today. I was obviously sober enough on many occasions, despite one of the local traditions of gumbei. You know, I sort of like that there's this tradition that when you're socializing, somebody looks at you across the table and says gumbei. It took me a little while to get it, but it means bottoms up. And of course, being a cooperative visitor, they say bottoms up, I comply. But I was able to observe the eagerness, the enthusiasm of the people, the dichotomies that exist, but the extraordinary market opportunities that exist, to see millions of people, many of whom, because of the economics and the affluence of people, are on bicycles, traveling. And that's part of their usual mode of transportation, to have one hand on the bicycle handle and the other on a cellular phone at their ear. And I mean millions. And to have visited the Tata Economic Development Area, which is, I believe, in a place called Tianjin, and to have visited the newly constructed Motorola plant there, where your phones, mine, and our beepers are undoubtedly being produced. And to listen to the people who operated it and their excitement about the fact that their salaries were not established by the central government, but by their performance in those businesses they had attracted. It was all quite astonishing and something to really appreciate. Now, around Washington, new industries, technology, old industries, hot air, our contribution to global warming. There appear to be no congressional representatives here, and I'll probably get away with this. But what is being produced there right now under the leadership of the ambassador is probably the most historic economic agreement ever negotiated by America for the world. And I know that our local businesses, our workers, the people who produce our electronics and parts and industrial equipment and sell it around the globe, will benefit from having access to the world's biggest market. And it's only going to grow, it's only going to get more accessible, and we deserve to be a part of that. When it happens, it will be good not only for them, but for us. And I'm sure you will pardon my self-interest in the matter, coming from a jurisdiction with a tax cap and lots of urban challenges. But it is important, not in just the glowing sense, but in a direct, tangible, local sense, that we continue to infuse our economy with the opportunities these new markets present. And I just got to compliment you. I've heard about all the agreements that you've negotiated. I heard about the 200 and some pages on this agreement alone. And you're such a sweet and diminutive lady. I want to know who carried it around for you. Your agreements we have begun to evaluate by the pound. And every time we do the assessment, it comes up right at the top. And you are doing a fabulous job for us, and I hope tomorrow that the Congress sucks it up. I understand the implications for some votes and gets this job done to complete the fine work that you've done. Thank you.
Saw a hand shoot up. Yes, sir.
Over the weekend, Jim Hovland of Washington Post and Outlook had an article about the PNTR, and you may have read it. He makes the observation that every time the United States offers a concession to China, China pokes its finger in the eye of the United States by clamping down on dissidents and exacerbating its human rights record and so on. Could you respond to that observation?
Yeah, I did see his piece in the Post, and I have to say that I didn't agree with it. I think there's no question that there is a significant human rights problem in China. There's also no question that the China today is not remotely the China of 20 years ago in terms of living standards, in terms of space for individual life, in terms of economic freedoms, and in terms of opportunities for growth, whether by moving from city to city within China or choosing your own job in China, which 20 years ago you could not do, or being one of the students from China that come to the United States to study, which 20 years ago you could not do. So I think there has been important progress in the aggregate in China. When we do get to the specific, then we do see human rights related issues that are very profound and disturbing. But the difficulty that I had with the article that I read is that it posits no alternative vision. Okay? If the U.S. repudiates China, how exactly does that help the human rights situation in China? What worker in China is benefited? What religious congregation in China is benefited? There's no alternative construct for how a country reforms if our answer is to repudiate it, including on the basis of reform it has already undertaken. This is one of the reasons that Martin Lee came to the United States 2 weeks ago, because he fears a Congress that will, as he said, punish 1.3 billion Chinese who need economic opportunity, who need further increases in living standards, who need to be subject to Western norms and Western values on a much larger scale than previously. And repudiating China certainly does not accomplish any of those aims. None.
I have just one question. You emphasize that this is a one-side concession, one-side winning. U.S. is winning and China is losing.
No.
No?
No.
My question is, if U.S. is got so many concessions from China, then does China still wants to enter WTO? Why?
This is absolutely a win-win agreement. Let me explain. First of all, to enter the WTO, countries make one-way concessions. That's how it's done. The WTO is an existing institution. You want to get in, you've got to agree you'll play by the rules, and you've got to open your market. That's the rule. It applies to China, it applies to Latvia and Lithuania and Bulgaria and Mongolia and the Kyrgyz Republic, all of whom have just acceded to the WTO. For China, I think the benefit of WTO accession is quite clear. And the reason that economic reformers in China want to enter the WTO is quite clear. China simply has to reform its economy. It has to modernize. There's a substantial problem, first off, that its economic rate of growth barely keeps pace with the need of job creation in China, given the size of the population. So you're looking at sort of a constant of job creation that's needed with an economic growth rate of a minimum of 8 to 9%. So, and that's to hold even. Based on population growth, that's to hold job growth even, let alone create jobs. So you have first off a problem that of job growth on a very massive scale that's needed in China. Second of all, you have a huge migration problem within China. Folks leaving rural areas, coming into the cities. Unemployment rates within the cities are very, very high. That's potentially destabilizing. What's the answer? China has to modernize its economy. It has to sort of leapfrog the development process. And to do that, it simply has to reform economically. Most world leaders will tell you that economic reform is very hard to effect if the only actors in the mix are economic reformers and your domestic politics. Everyone likes the status quo. As the president says, everyone likes change in general, but never in particular. And it's absolutely true. So what many countries have done, Mexico did this in the 80s, but all the former Soviet republics are doing it now. They want to join the WTO on the basis of the kind of reform they want to effect in their domestic market. They're then able, in their domestic market, to say, we must reform. We have an international treaty that requires it. And it's that external pressure, working with economic reformers in the country, that have effected a substantial transformation. Poland is a wonderful example, but also Hungary, Czechoslovakia, those countries that emerged from communist domination a little earlier on. They're very, very good examples of this phenomenon. Mexico is a very good example of this phenomenon. Without the pressure of the GATT system on Mexico, the kind of internal reform that was effected in the 1980s would have been reversed by the early 90s. It wasn't because they had a treaty obligation and couldn't. China sees the same possibility. It must reform economically. It's got to create more jobs. It's got to become a more modern economy. But it also needs that external pressure to help that internal reform process. And that's what it sees WTO doing. It cements internal reform. And that's why we should want it. We should want it. Good.
Well, it's always interesting when what you're going to say and the audience's answer is done about 10 minutes before you end. And of course, it was stated that the case was made clearly, and I would add comprehensively and convincingly, and you would have applauded, but instead we heard, ain't it the truth? But for a thoroughly enjoyable afternoon, and one that I think was informative far beyond what we would have imagined, we'd like to thank you very much.